All right, so as a way to lead into this next section, let's just return for a moment to these last couple of sentences from the previous paragraph. So the so-called stimulus, being the total state of the organism, moves of itself because of the tensions contained into those activities of pursuit, which are called the response. So the tensions, the bodily tensions that come from the relation of the organism to its environment, kind of the state of deprivation, however you want to say it, transitions into the pursuit of the object, which are called the response, the stimulus. The stimulus is simply the earlier part of the total coordinated serial behavior, and the response the later part. So Dewey's idea here of stimulus and response as phases of the act. So it's not that they're not separate things. So one is just the earlier part, one the later part. So, and he's going to expand on this idea in the following. That's why I wanted to mention that. So let's go on to this next section here, this next paragraph. So the principle involved in the distinction just drawn is more important than it may seem to be at first sight. If it is ignored, the sequential character of behavior is lost from view. So what does this mean? Well, so he's going to tell us. So behavior then becomes simply a succession of isolated and independent units of excitation reaction. So excitation reaction, these more limited exciting of a reaction from the body, some energy in the environment. The organism responds in a brief way. So you hear a loud noise, you kind of jerk your head or whatever. Or you can think of the knee-jerk response, where there's something from the environment that strikes your body in a certain way, and you have this immediate response. So behavior then becomes simply a succession of isolated and independent units of excitation reaction, which would be comparable, say, to a succession of muscular twitches due to a disordered nervous mechanism. So if you ignore that stimulus and response are integrally related, are just phases of one thing, then you're left with this picture of the organism where, as he said in a much earlier paper, his paper on the reflex arc concept, then behavior just becomes a series of jerks rather than the more fluid sequence of activity that we normally know it as. And I'll maybe mention here, this is clear throughout that a lot of this is, or was, I should say, first developed really in his famous paper of 1896 called something like the reflex arc concept in psychology. It's a very famous paper, which I feel unfortunately people kind of know the name, but they haven't really taken it to heart. And this is, returning to that, to the ideas that he developed in that paper, and that have really been a mainstay of his thought throughout all these decades. So when the stimulus is recognized to be the tension in the total organic activity, ultimately reducible to that between contact activities and those occasioned through distance receptors, it is seen that the stimulus in its relationship to special activities persists throughout the entire pursuit, although it changes its actual content at each stage of the chase. That's a long sentence. Could maybe briefly break it down. So again, the stimulus is this state of tension in the body set up between, he says reducible to the basically the tension between contact activities and distance reception, between the bodily contact with its immediate environment and with itself, which may be unsatisfactory, and the things that it sees in the distance or hears in the distance that can satisfy it, right? So there's this state of what the behaviorists would call state of deprivation, along with the perception in a distance from the organism of conditions that would satisfy that state of deprivation or fulfill that state of deprivation. So the stimulus in its relationship to special activities persists. So this state of stimulation persists, right? This state of tension, or this contrast between desire and what can fulfill the desire, perception of what can fulfill the desire, this contrast or this tension persists, although it changes at each stage of the pursuit, of the chase, as conditions change, of course, as it moves through the environment, basically changes its environment to come into contact with, to achieve that contact with the thing it wants. As the animal runs, specific sensory excitations, those of contact and those that are olfactory and visual, alter with every change of position. So that's clear enough, right? As it moves through the environment, its contact sensations, its distance perceptions alter. With every change in the character of the ground, with changing objects like bushes and rocks that progressively intervene, and they also change in intensity with every change in distance from the hunted object. Yeah, so that should be, I think, clear enough. Its perceptions change as it changes its relationship to its environment and to the object it is pursuing. So going on, the changing excitations are, however, integrated into a single stimulus by the total state of the organism. So there's an integration of all these changes into the organism itself. The theory that identifies stimuli with a succession of specific sensory excitations cannot possibly account for such unified and continuous responses as hunting and stalking prey. So such unified and continuous responses. There's maybe some important background here in terms of behaviorism, which was developing at the same time. B.F. Skinner's kind of first substantial work, perhaps, was published the same year as Dewey's Logic. So B.F. Skinner's The Behavior of Organisms, I believe it's called, was published 1938, same year as this, if I'm getting my facts correct. And around this time, I forget exactly, maybe a little bit later, E.C. Tolman, another behaviorist, made a distinction between molecular and molar behaviorism. And of course, this is based on ideas previous, so from the time Dewey is writing and before, about whether behavior is built up out of these smaller molecular kinds of, or atomistic kinds of responses into something, into a whole, right? Whether it's built up out of these smaller things, or whether the whole comes first, whether these larger patterns come first. This larger continuity comes first, and then we analyze out these little individual, we can analyze things as small as we want, basically, but in maybe the functional sense of behavior, the organism's behavior from the organism perspective, we need to take these larger units as being more fundamental. And that's kind of the same contrast that Dewey is talking about here. This difference between a theory that identifies stimuli with a succession of specific sensory excitations, so all these little excitations and reactions to those excitations adding up into a kind of larger response. That doesn't really help us account for these really long-term behaviors, these unified and continuous responses like hunting or stalking prey. It's hard to build up such a behavior out of small excitation reaction units. So on the theory that the animal would have to make at each stage a new and isolated response, or reaction technically, and a number of people, theorists, have made a distinction between response and reaction, which Dewey is continuing here, where a reaction is something more immediate, unconscious even, like a instinctive reaction to something, or the reaction of a part of your body. When you get poked by a needle or something, there's a organic reaction. It's not necessarily a behavioral response. You don't necessarily have a behavioral response. You might, but you might not. The same thing with what Dewey talked before about these, a sharp noise, a sudden noise. You may have an immediate reaction to it, but you may not do anything about it. You may not have an actual behavioral response. So can you build up a response out of reactions? And Dewey is saying, no, you can't. That's not how a response comes about. These are different things. So on that theory, this theory of sensory excitations, the animal would have to make at each stage a new and isolated response, actually reaction, to everything that came across his path. He would be reacting to stones, bushes, and to changes in the levels and character of the ground in so many independent acts that there would be no continuity of behavior. He would forget, as we say, what he was after in the multitude of separate reactions he would have to make to independent excitations. So the behavior, it would be hard to conceive of behavior as an accumulation or aggregation of all these separate responses, because then you lose sight of what the key element in the situation that you're responding to. If you have to make these individual responses / reactions to each new thing that happens. Because behavior is, in fact, a function of the total state of the organism in relation to environment, stimuli are functionally constant in spite of changes in specific content. So functionally constant. There's a functional continuity of stimuli because you're dealing with a whole organism in relation to what it has determined as important in its environment, as what that state of the organism has picked out of the environment as important to it. Because of this fact, behavior is sequential, one act growing out of another and leading cumulatively to a further act until the consummatory fully integrated activity occurs. So acts grow organically out of each other, cumulatively, until the act reaches its consummation. Because organic, let me see, I've got some notes here, see if anything I mentioned that. I guess one other thing to mention quickly is the relationship between this view where you're building up larger behaviors out of small excitation reaction units. There's a relation between that, I think, and theories of perception, which involve building up a perception out of these small units, sometimes called qualia. Qualia has different meaning, but these small units of qualia, patches of color or snippets of sound or something, and then the idea is that the organism somehow puts all those together to form these larger perceptions of the environment. And that also is something that Dewey writes against in other places. I'm not sure about in this chapter specifically, but elsewhere and in other writings, he addresses that. And so for Dewey, you actually begin the other way. You begin with these more holistic kind of kinds of perceptions, perceptions of objects, of situations, or of objects in situations, which are really what's important to the organism. It doesn't matter whether we see snatches of this or that color, or atoms of sound or whatever. We need to know what are the stuff we need to deal with in the environment. So we begin with that, and then you can analyze that as small as you want. And actually qualia are something we analyze out of these larger perceptions. Okay, but I don't want to get too much into that right now. I'm just noting this parallel between this theory of this continuity of behavior in contrast to this theory of molecular behaviorism, as we might call it, and this theory of perception. All right, but going on to this next paragraph, going on to page 38, because organic behavior is what it is and not a succession of compounding of independent discrete reflex arc units, it has direction and cumulative force. Again, see his reflex arc paper of 1896. There are special acts, like winking or the knee jerk, that exemplify the isolated reflex arc that is sometimes supposed to be the unit which, through compounding, constitutes behavior. So there are these reflex arc-like behaviors, these isolated behaviors, excitation, reaction units. You can find these, but there is no evidence that such acts have played any role in development, in the development of the organism, in the organism's history. So on the contrary, the available evidence shows that they are endpoints of highly specialized lines of development, or else are coincident byproducts of the behavior structures that have arisen developmentally. So you can think of these isolated acts as in two kind of ways, maybe, and this will maybe become more clear when Dewey gets into habit, as he does in the next paragraph. But yeah, so maybe keep that in mind for now. This latter point is maybe a little easier to understand previously. So you can think of these isolated reflex actions as byproducts, right? As perhaps the way the organism is set up, right? Take the knee-jerk reaction, for example. Is that something, this is not quite Dewey's point, but you can think of it in terms of, is that knee-jerk response something that was evolutionarily useful? Does it have an evolutionary function? And maybe it does. I don't know the research on that particular reaction. Or is it just a consequence of how the body got put together, so to speak? Of course, it wasn't really put together, but of how the body evolved and how it was wired and all of that. Is it just kind of a byproduct of that? In either case, these are not super important for understanding development. They may come out of development, but they're not going to help us understand the development of behavior. So going on, he says, what exists in normal behavior development is thus a circuit, of which the earlier or open phase is the tension of various elements of organic energy, while the final and closed phase is the institution of integrated interaction of organism and environment. So circuit. Circuit is a good metaphor, is often a good metaphor for talking about biology and behavior. So the circuit, and this has been used by many more recent thinkers as well. It's been used very often subsequently to Dewey. It was, I'm sure, used before Dewey. But yeah, it's a pretty good metaphor, I think, for behavior, where there's this circuit between, as he says, tension of various elements of organic energy, various parts of the body tending, or energies in the body tending in a certain direction, which is closed, reaches a close when the organism reintegrates itself with the environment. So this integration is represented upon the organic side by equilibration of organic energies, so putting these energies back into balance. And upon the environmental side by the existence of satisfying conditions. So there are satisfying conditions in the environment which, when attained, put the organism back into equilibration. Or equilibrium, I guess, is the proper noun there. Let's see. So in the behavior of higher organisms, the close of the circuit between the tension of organic energies tending to make the organism go out into the environment, explore the environment, pursue things in the environment. So the close of the circuit, when it reaches what it wanted from the environment, it attains its prey or whatever, the close of the circuit is not identical with the state out of which disequilibration and tension emerged. So in higher organisms, there's never a return to the identical state, to a state that's identical with what came before there was this disequilibration, this state of need or whatever. A certain modification of the environment has also occurred, of course, right? The organism modifies its environment to put itself back into an equilibrium kind of state and to get its energies back into balance. So a certain modification of the environment has also occurred, though it may only be a change in the condition which future behavior must meet. On the other hand, there is change in the organic structures that condition further behavior. This modification constitutes what is termed habit. So that, as we're going to see, the consequences of the organism's behavior, so they change the environment, of course, and change, we've talked about that in the last video, how changes in the environment change needs, change what the organism is going to do and be able to do and want to do in the future, and it also changes the organism. And this change to the organism is basic to what we call habit. So now more on habit. So habits are the basis of organic learning, how the organism learns. According to the theory of independent successive units of excitation reaction, habit formation can mean only the increasing fixation of certain ways of behavior through repetition and an attendant weakening of other behavioral activities. All right, so this is looking at habit from the other perspective, kind of the molecular behaviorist perspective, where you have these independent units of excitation reaction. And habit in that sense can only mean, according to Dewey, fixing things through repetition with weakening of other behavioral activities. Developmental behavior shows, so Dewey's version of developmental behavior shows, or Dewey's version of what happens, thinking in terms of development. So he writes, developmental behavior shows, on the other hand, that in the higher organisms, excitations are so diffusely linked with reactions that the sequel is affected by the state of the organism in relation to the environment. So this is kind of another way this has been put is the SOR theories. So you have the SR, stimulus response theories of behaviorism, and there's kind of the SOR, stimulus organism response. So there's not So SR, kind of a classical SR was this reflex arc, excitation reaction theory. SOR is more what Dewey is pointing to. I don't know if you would want to explain it in terms of an SOR theory, which might sound too mechanistic or whatever, but basically the state of the organism matters because there's in higher organisms there's a delay, right? There's a diffusion of the linkage. I don't know if that is quite the right way of saying it, but the link is not as immediate. So then the state of the organism has to be taken into account. Because there's a complicated, right, the link between excitation and reaction can be very complicated. It's not an immediate, direct kind of thing in these more complex, higher organisms like humans, for example, and many other animal forms. Yeah, so the sequel, the subsequent behavior, the response is affected by the state of the organism in relation to the environment. In habit and learning, the linkage is tightened up not by sheer repetition, but by the institution of effective integrated interaction of organic environing energies, the consummatory close of activities of exploration and search. It's a very complicated phrase there. Let's look at that again. So in habit and learning, the linkage, so the linkage between excitation and reaction, stimulus and response, the linkage is tightened up not by repeating the same thing again and again, but because of the consequences of the act. So it's not repetition per se that builds habit in higher organisms, but the consequences of their action, which integrate organic and environmental energies, put them into a kind of balance, or balance the organism so it's not in a state of tension and need. And so that is what institutes the habit, or helps build the habit. In organisms of the higher order, the special and more definite pattern of recurrent behavior is thus formed and does not become completely rigid. So this is important, that in higher organisms, behavior does not become completely rigid. It enters as a factorial agency. So patterns of behavior enter, or habits enter as a factorial agency, as a factor in determining what happens, along with other patterns in a total adaptive response, and hence retains a certain amount of flexible capacity to undergo further modifications as the organism meets new environing conditions. So the organism builds up various habits through past successful actions, and these all become factors in its responses to a new situation. So it never does quite the same thing again and again, right? We never do quite the same thing each time unless it's a very, very, very repetitive kind of situation, and Dewey will refer to that later on. But we get flexibility because we have these multiple habits being brought to bear as factors, as tendencies in the body called out by different situations, by new situations. So there is, for example, going on to this next paragraph, there is, for example, reciprocal excitation between hand and eye activity. A movement of the hand is aroused by visual activity, then the movement of the hand is followed by a change in visual activity, and so on. So there's this interaction or interplay or transaction, to use a more Deweyan term, between hand contact activities of the hand, manipulatory activities of the hand, and visual activity. And this was a big theme in George Herbert Mead's writing as well. There Dewey and Mead are very close in many respects. Here is a definite recurring pattern of action. If the hand never did but one thing, say reach, then this habit pattern might become rigidly set. Right? So if there was just this one behavior, then it would become rigid. If there was this one relation between vision and reaching, then it would become a very rigid kind of thing. But, as he says, but the hand also grabs, pushes, draws, and manipulates. Visual behavior has to be responsive to the performance of a great variety of manual activities. It thus maintains flexibility and readaptability. The connection between hand and eye does not become a rigid bond. Right? So it's not a rigid, it's not a habit in the rigid sense, where one thing happens, another thing happens. Where your hand moves here, your eye does this. But because your hand has to do many other things, your eyes also have to do many other things, building up many, many different habits that relate to each other in very, very complex ways. All right, so this is the last paragraph I'm going to do in this section to finish up. So, the view that habits are formed by sheer repetition puts the cart before the horse. So I think there is a kind of common sense view that habit is built up by repetition. This used to be done in learning, and of course Dewey is famous for his educational theories, but teachers used to, drill. I think teachers still do this to some extent. You drill, you repeat to build up habits. Right? Multiplication tables. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times 3 is 3, and so on. So by repetition, you can build up these habits, but you can build up habit, a kind of habit of response, but that's not what is original to the organism. That's kind of a late development that puts the cart before the horse, as he says. So ability to repeat is a result of a formation of habit through the organic redispositions affected by attainment of consummatory close. So the ability to repeat something actually is a result of having gone through successful behavior patterns, having achieved successful results, beneficial consequences. Again, this is very much what B.F. Skinner would be talking about later with the theory of operant behaviors. That was in my notes earlier to point out, but I forgot, where an operant behavior is built up through its consequences, through successful consequences, or behavior is habitual behaviors, operants can be undone through painful consequences, right? Through consequences that are not good for the organism. So you break down and build up habits through consequences, through the consequences of behaviors in response to the environmental stimulations. All right, so where was I? Right. So this modification of the organism's tendency to behave, ability to react in certain ways, this modification through consequences, through the attainment of consummatory close, this modification is equivalent to giving some definite direction to future actions. So it kind of biases the organism in a certain direction. As far as environing conditions remain much the same, the resulting act will look like a repetition of previously performed act. So if the environment stays very much the same, then acts will tend to be the same if they remain being successful, right? But even then, repetition will not be exact as far as conditions differ. Sheer repetition is, in the case of the human organism, the product of conditions that are uniform because they have been made so mechanically, as in much school and factory quote-unquote work. Right. So, kind of rigid repetition, exact repetition, is not something natural, so to speak, because nature never stands still. But humans, as artifactual creatures, as highly cultural creatures, we can build situations that remain very stable, consistent. Maybe think of an assembly line where you're doing the same repetitive thing over and over. So that you can build up, of course, very rigid habits of behavior out of that. But that's a very highly advanced, though unnatural, condition. That takes a very high development of technology and culture. Not necessarily for the best, right? But it takes it took human civilization a long time to get to that point where we could institute these very rigid situations. Such habits are limited in their manifestation to the rather artificial conditions in which they operate. They certainly do not provide the model upon which a theory of habit formation and operation should be framed. So don't take factory work as your model of behavior, for example, because that's something rather artificial and unusual, historically speaking. So we have to be careful about what kinds of behaviors we take as paradigmatic if we're trying to understand how behavior works, and thus how inquiry and logic work. So that's, I think, a good point to keep in mind. And I will finish up here and continue on with some of his basic conclusions in the next video. You can see kind of below, he's going to start talking about some general conclusions that you can draw from the foregoing discussion. So now is a good point to stop, and that's all for now.